Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Adventure Sports Podcast. This is Caleb. In addition to the work that I do for the Adventure Sports Podcast, I am also a video game composer. And in addition to my background in music, I also have a background in philosophy. It's something that I studied a lot in college. And I thought it would be fun to combine the two. So recently I started a YouTube channel where I talk about the congruence of music and creativity in general with AI and how AI can affect creativity, the human creative spirit, and the human creative conversation. And it's just me thinking through what AI means for human creativity and things that we can do, practical things that we can do to preserve our own human creative spirit in light of all that. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check out the link for that YouTube channel in the description below.
You're listening to the Adventure Sports Podcast. We talk with adventurers from around the globe to bring you the inspiration and motivation you need to get started in the outdoors or to keep you moving if you're already there.
In this episode, Kurt interviews Tristan Gooley. Tristan is an author and natural navigator expert. He's spent decades learning the clues and signs in nature across the globe about how to navigate using the natural signs like the sun and the stars and even the environment around him, such as plants, the weather, and those sorts of things. Tristan has led pioneering expeditions, sailed boats across oceans, and piloted small aircraft to Africa and the Arctic. He has also ran fun experiments like testing ancient Viking navigation methods. He is the only living person to have both flown solo and sailed single-handed across the Atlantic, and he is a fellow of the Royal Institute of Navigation. Unfortunately, the beginning of this episode was cut off, and Kurt tells a story which Tristan is responding to at the start of the episode. Unfortunately, we don't have the audio for that story, and Kurt is still returning from Africa, so there's not a possibility of he recreating it. From the context of the podcast, though, I think I have a pretty good idea of what the story was, and so I'll do my best to give context for the beginning of the episode. Several years ago, my dad and cousin and I were in the woods. We were off trail, and my cousin asked my dad which way was north or what the different directions were based on where the sun was. We weren't in any danger or anything. We knew exactly where we were. It was more of just a thought experiment to see if we could figure out our directions based purely off the sun. My dad looked around and he became quite puzzled because based on his understanding at the time, the sun was in the wrong place. It was not where it should have been. From that experience, he and my cousin actually sat down and did the geometry to figure out the direction of the sun and where we were in that time of year, so that then they could sort out how to use the sun to tell the cardinal directions. I'm 95% sure that's what the story is. At the very least, it fits within the context of the episode, and hopefully I'm right. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this episode. It's a truly fascinating episode, amazing conversation. All right, enough of me. Here we go.
Yeah, these skills will definitely help you if the kit fails, but I really encourage people to nurture them for when the going's good, because it's the best possible way to connect with our surroundings, to sense and see things that most people don't. In your second example, that was a really, really good example of where, you felt lost, but then you actually had the two core skills there. So you had a sign that was giving you some idea of direction, the moon, and then you have what we commonly refer to as a handrail in navigation, the highway. And all natural navigation is instead of having one or two very, very kind of bold things like that, you're tuning into absolutely everything in your surroundings as much as you want to. You mentioned also you've been on a deer hunt, and it's notorious if you're trailing an animal, or stalking, or hunting or anything like that. However good a navigator you are, you will become disorientated. Our brain isn't actually capable of taking in all of these cues whilst doing something that's as a sort of resource hungry as following an animal in the wild. So then it's about retuning into things, but yeah, as I say, it really is, I think, a skill for fun and connection, not just emergency. It's great stuff to have if it's all going upside down, but I use it as much on days when the sun's out and things are going well as I do on times when I'm trying to challenge myself.
I couldn't agree more. What has happened because of these experiences is I've started trying to learn more and learn more and learn more, and it kind of turned into a lifelong pursuit. Now, I never got as skilled at it as I know that you are, not even close. But I'm here to learn today because I want to know more about this. The first big backpacking trip I took my oldest son on, he was 13, I believe. And as we're hiking out, again, off trail, seems like that's the way life is for us. But as we're hiking out, at one point, he just said, "Dad, where are you going?" And I stopped and I took account of my surroundings and where the sun was and the shadows and all that sort of thing. And I said, "You're absolutely right. I'm going the wrong way." And so he's the one with the compass in his head. But the point you just made about if you just take the time to connect with everything, you get so much more out of it than just a direction, right?
Totally. And we can take your examples and experiences there, and maybe combine some of what the academics have found out as well. So when you were traversing some high ground, and you hadn't noticed that the lay of the land had changed effectively, and the high ground had led you round in a different direction. What the academics have found, and we've all experienced ourselves in some form or another, as you were recounting there, is that without external reference, human beings will walk in circles effectively. Without external reference, there's nothing internal. There's a lot of research going into how some animals, not least birds, do have internal ways of sensing direction. But my point here, what's largely misunderstood, is that in the academic world and in areas where people haven't given this any thought, there's this belief that the external references are very few. Like it's the sun, or it's the North Star, or it's the moon, or it's a distant peak, or it's a coastline. The kind of feeling, if you haven't ever given this whole area of natural navigation any thought, is those are the only things that are going to help you. But actually, what my work has been about for the last 20 years is refining that to the point where absolutely everything can help you. So, I mean, the way grasses are bent over by the wind, that is not random. I've under high pressure conditions, found things miles away in fog, just using the way the grass is bent. So that's something that might only be 7 feet from our nose, and can help us actually find something that's a few miles away. It doesn't have to be a big sun or moon.
There's so many directions that we could go with this conversation right now. And lest I forget, I just want people to know that you have a lot of resources to help with this. And it's an amazing hobby. It is a pastime. Not only could it save a life, but like you said, it's just connects you with the natural world around you in such an amazing way. So I want everyone to know about these resources. We will revisit them later in the show. But you have several books. The most recent being The Hidden Seasons. And then you have like 4 or 5 more along the same lines. Tell me if I'm listing these books correctly here. I see The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs, The Walker's Guide to Outdoor Clues and Signs, How to
Those
Read
two
Water.
are the same book. Sorry to jump in there. So my North American publishers took the UK title, The Walker's Guide to Outdoor Clues and Signs, and changed it to The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs.
Interesting. Okay. How to Read Water from 2016. The Secret World of Weather, that's another one that I think is pretty cool, from 2021. So I'm moving forward in time as we go here. How to Read a Tree, 2023, and then The Hidden Seasons, which is your latest, 2025. Did I miss any?
I think there's a couple, but you know, if people want to have a a dive, then all the information's out there on all the usual places and my website naturalnavigator.com where I sort of explain. But I'm always happy to get messages, people sort of saying, what's the difference between this and this? And in summary, I'm taking a simple, powerful philosophy, which is everything outdoors is a clue and a sign. It is trying to tell us something. And then I'm coming at that idea from different angles and with different content. So how to read water and how to read a tree, it's pretty obvious the angle I'm taking there. How to read a tree is the 200 different clues that we can get by just looking at an average tree. We're not looking for special species. We're talking about a tree you can see in a park in a city, or a tree in the back of beyond. How to read water, it's how, if you think of your favorite patch of water, it could be anything. It could be a pond in a city or a massive ocean. Every time you look at it, it looks slightly different, and all of those differences, sure. It's a language. I sometimes think of it as the hub and spoke model, where at the hub is that very simple idea: everything outdoors is a clue. And then each book is a spoke of me coming at it. So the most recent book, The Hidden Seasons, I'm taking this idea that we look for different signs at different times of the year. There's January is not the most rewarding time to make a compass out of wildflowers. You can still do it in January, but you're going to have a lot more fun doing that in May and June. Whereas midwinter is fantastic for looking at star compasses. And there are different weather signs at different times of the year, different cloud patterns and clues in those. So yeah, that's all I'm doing, is taking it's one idea that I've been, having fun throwing myself at for 20 something years now.
Oh, so fun. In way of example, let's do the trees. And the reason is because when I was a kid, I read some sort of a little survival guidebook that said the moss grows on the north side of the tree. Sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you just said that trees can give us all sorts of signs, right? So let's talk about what you can learn by just reading a tree.
Yeah, absolutely. The key here is nothing is random. So you will never, ever, of the billions of trees on planet Earth, will probably in a lifetime see hundreds of thousands of them, probably millions. You'll never see two that are the same. And every difference, there's a cause, and therefore there's meaning, therefore there's a sign. So let's actually get a bit more kind of nuts and boltsy here. Trees are not symmetrical. If you ask somebody to draw a tree, they draw a symmetrical tree because that's our idea of a tree. But trees are not symmetrical. They grow bigger on their south side. The branches are closer to horizontal on the south side, closer to vertical on the north side. And it's all to do with asymmetry of light. If you're north of the tropics, the sun is due south in the middle of the day, every day of the year. And the way I think of it is the sun, the wind, water, and a few other things are leaving footprints on everything, not least the trees. So there are over 20 ways we can navigate with big, bold signs in trees. And then it comes down to some quite subtle ones, like, the color of bark is typically very slightly different on the north and south side. But even in the center of a city, look at the most exposed part of the tree, the very highest part of the tallest trees. And you'll just notice it bent over, typically from west to east or something close to that, depending what the prevailing winds are in your part of the world. But as I say, every single, the leaves are smaller and lighter in color on the south side, bigger and darker on the north side of a tree. And a lot of these things sit just below the obvious. Some things are obvious. If you ask, hopefully if you ask any child over about, age 8 or 9, they will be able to tell you that you can age a tree stump by counting the rings. That's something that has survived. But what I'm really doing is blowing the dust off of things that are not obvious, that our ancestors probably did know, but that we've sort of let go. But you have to A, know what to look for, and B, give these things just not a lot. Sometimes it's only a few seconds, but you have to make that conscious choice. I'm going to look for the way the roots stretch away from the base of the tree on the side the winds come from, and how that can make a compass.
Very, very cool. This weekend, we had grabbed a permit from the Forest Service, and we went into the woods, hiking through about 14 inches of snow, looking for our holiday Christmas tree. And you just said trees aren't symmetrical. When we go looking for a Christmas tree, you realize that right away because it's like, oh, well, this one's flat on this side. You know what I'm saying? No tree is symmetrical, not unless it's been pruned that way. And
No,
it's a lot of
absolutely. And just
fun, all the things you see.
I'm getting images of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. Those scenes. When you say it appears flatter on one side, that's very possibly an example of flagging. So wherever you get regular snow, or if you're close to the coast and you get salt-laden winds, we find that the branches struggle on the side the winds come from. The buds die and then the branches die off. So you end up with a bare or a struggling side of the tree. And it's known as flagging because if we imagine the branches are pointing in the direction the wind's blowing, because they're struggling on the side the wind comes from. And so much of natural navigation is just tuning in. And you only have to do it once in each region. When I go to a new part of the world, one of the first things I want to know is what is the prevailing wind direction? Where do most of the strong winds come from? Because those are some of the easiest footprints to see in any landscape.
In Colorado, we see the flagging a lot on ridge lines where the wind is often from the same direction. Not always, but often from the same direction. We see flagging like that. You have to know what the winds are likely to do to understand the flag, I would think. That would be the one caveat.
Oh, totally, yes. And so with all wind clues, we're reading a story and we're being sensitive to time. So the floppier something is and the more exposed it is, the shorter its memory. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about grasses or mighty trees. The more effort it takes for the wind to change their shape, the longer their memory. So the more dependable they are. So if, for example, a good example is in the UK, we get most of our strong winds from the southwest. And so I know that in most regions in the UK and indeed Northwest Europe, I'm going to see most of these footprints, from the wind from the southwest towards the northeast. But here, like everywhere, there are some valleys that don't line up. So I was doing some hill walking in a place called the Yorkshire Dales, and there the valleys tend to be west to east. So the southwest winds come in, and then they get channeled down the valley. Nature doesn't lie, but you've got to understand what the relationship between the wind, time, and place. The very floppiest leaves and branches on a tree will change day to day. But the toughest trees, as you get near the tree line, in Colorado, you'll have spent plenty of time above the tree line, I'm sure. So you'll know what I mean. That once you get to the point where the trees are struggling, you get these kind of gnarled, twisted, shorter trees, and they're clinging on for life, but they're giving a pretty strong message because they've lasted decades probably of quite harsh winds. So whatever the wind does one week to another, they're not going to suddenly change shape. They're effectively sculpted into quite a gnarly fixed form.
I have found that most of the flagging, the limbs point east in Colorado because our prevailing winds are from the west. But we also get a lot of strong northern winds in the wintertime, and then in the other times of the year you can get southwesterly winds, that sort of thing. But if you know the topography, it's a really good clue. So I've heard this said, I don't even know if it's true, but I want to ask you this in this way. I've heard it said that if a deer sees you, that's not enough to scare it. If it sees and hears you, it'll run away. If it hears and smells you, it'll run away. If it only smells you, it'll probably put its head back down and continue to graze. What I'm saying here is it takes 2 clues to startle a deer. Maybe. That could just that could just be a colloquialism that's not true. But that said, how many clues should we be looking for when we're trying to use natural navigation to confirm that we haven't made a mistake? For instance, the valley turns the wind and the tree points south in this one location.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll answer it in a moment if I may, because I just want to come back to your 2 things with the deer. In my latest book, The Hidden Seasons, there's a tiny section in it called the Law of 2 Sounds, and it's basically that prey animals are having to be sensitive to their environment the whole time, because if there's a predator out there, it could be their last day. But that said,
Sure.
there's always a mixture of living and non-living sounds in any landscape, by which I mean, if there's a wind of any sort, there are going to be branches bending. There's going to be the sound of foliage. There's going to be the odd snap as dry, weak branches break, that sort of thing. Let's take the deer. The deer, every time it hears a sound that could be another animal, it can't stop grazing because, and browsing. It can't, because there's always enough noise out there. So what all animals are generally doing is a probability game. It's what all animals are doing. They just basically go, okay, some twig snapping over there, what's the likelihood that's a predator? Not very likely. I might lift my head, I might lift my ears, but I'm not going to kind of, charge away. I'm not going to go into flight behavior. But if they hear two sounds from that same location, the probability that that's, non-living drops, and the probability that's living shoots up. And as you're saying, if they pick up a scent and a sound, or they pick up a sight and a scent, it just shrinks the probability that this is, something it can ignore. So this is how we learn to predict animal behavior. Is you learn the kind of alert behavior, then you learn the flight behavior, then you learn the refuge behavior. And if you bolt all of those together, you can actually have a bit of fun, because you can go, right, I'm going to take 2 paces forward. That fallow deer is going to go uphill because that's the flight behavior, and it's going to head towards those trees because that's the refuge behavior. If you don't explain the different steps to somebody, and then the deer does exactly what you've said it's going to do, they think it's psychic, but it's not. It's just Lego. It's just putting pieces together. But in answer to your question, how many signs do we need? When I'm teaching on my courses, but also when I'm writing about it, I generally encourage a top-down view, by which I mean we go celestial. What are the sun, moon, stars, and occasionally planets telling us? Then we drop down to wind and weather, and then we come down to surface clues. The reason we do it in that order is because, like so much stuff I share, I learned the hard, stupid way, which is that if you spend a wonderful 10 minutes inspecting lichens or mosses on a rock or a tree, when the sun is out, and then you stand up 10 minutes later as the cloud seals the sun out for the next 3 days, you feel like an idiot. So you take the really powerful celestial cues when you can, and you bag them. In my case, if it's practical stuff, you drop the sun to the horizon, by which I mean you imagine it's like a stone falling vertically. Then you pick something on the horizon, because that way, if you lose the sun, does the same thing for moon or stars, you've probably still got something you can see in the horizon. You've got to be thinking about cloud bases and all that sort of good stuff as well. But generally, let's say there's a medium height, distinctive rock formation on a ridge line that's not the very highest thing, that's not going to disappear as the clouds drop, that's a few miles away from you. Then the clouds can come over you. You can get this thick stratus blanket, which means you don't get any celestial cues perhaps for a day. But whenever you've got sight of that rock formation, you've gone, for simplicity's sake, we'll say it's the middle of the day, the sun dropped onto that rock formation. Okay, that is south. Unless you walk a very long distance, it's going to give you a good sense of direction. Once you come down to wind and weather, you're going to want to back that up with something, because the wind may change. I mean, generally speaking, unless there's a significant weather change, the wind direction before it started mixing with the topography in the land is fairly constant. And then as we come down to the ground, we want more than one or two things. We start to think of it as a tapestry. So you're not going to look at just flagging and go, right, let's head off for 5 miles in this direction. You're going to look at the flagging. You're going to look at the lichens on the rock. You're going to sense the wind as well. You're going to start to put several pieces together. And so with celestial cues, you only need one. If you know how to find the North Star or use the sun or the moon, then you genuinely don't need another directional cue. You're still going to be tuning into things, because that's what I'm doing all the time is if it's a nice sunny day, it takes all of 2 seconds to get a very strong sense of direction, and even to sort of mark it on the horizon and things like that. But that's when you really feast on the other things. So a good example would be, I was walking in the Lake District, northwest England, a few days ago, and I get a sense of direction from the sun. Then being the Lake District, that doesn't last very long. The clouds blot that out. but I've now still got that sense of direction from the shape of the land, and having dropped it to the horizon, I can now put a lot of faith into the lichen patterns. Yes, that is south. Yes, those bright green lichens, map lichens as they're known, they are giving me a strong sense of south. They are responding to the light, and then you're tuning into the shape of the land and everything else. So you can never have too many. But if you bank the celestial help when you can, the rest of it's a good fun luxury.
Hey friends, I want to take a minute to tell you about Campfire Ranch. My friend Sam started Campfire Ranch several years ago, and his goal, his mission, is to energize places by creating meaningful human experiences in the outdoors. At all of the Campfire Ranch locations, from their campgrounds to trailside lodges to backcountry huts, their goal is to help you stay in the place and in the way that you want so that you can spend more time getting out there and getting after it. Campfire Ranch Little Sugar is a trailside lodge located in Bella Vista, Arkansas, just north of Bentonville, the mountain bike capital of the world. The lodge features 7 private bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms and communal spaces for gathering, meeting with others, and relaxing after a long day on the trails. Little Sugar has immediate access to 160-plus miles of public trails designed for mountain biking, gravel biking, trail running, and hiking, and it also has easy access to the food, art, and music scene of downtown Bentonville. So grab some buddies and go to www.campfireranch.co/ASP. That's not .com, it's .co/ASP, and you'll get 15% off nightly base rates at Little Sugar in Bella Vista, Arkansas. And this opportunity is valid all the way through 2026. But you know how these things go. Your weekend is going to fill up quickly, so go right now to campfireranch.co/ASP to plan your big adventure. You know, I want to talk about the sun in a minute because the sun has both helped me and confused me. And I want to come back to that because it can be misleading if you don't understand the way that it works. A lot of people would like to think, well, it rises in the east and it sets in the west, and that's all I need to know. But that is not all you need to know. I can guarantee you. But I want to go back to the trees, just in way of example, where we were looking for the Christmas tree. We were in a valley with limited light. The mountain we were on a north-facing slope, for the most part, northeast. And there were tall trees and small trees. And, of course, we're looking for the right size smaller one. But the bigger ones are casting shadows. And the trees all chase the light. And so some of the trees grow in these erratic, crazy patterns because they are just trying to find a little bit of sun. And so the flagging can get really confused, right? Especially with the smaller trees. But what was obviously apparent, you're looking for a Christmas tree, and you say, well, it doesn't have any limbs on this side. And then you look right beside it, and oh, there's a tree twice as tall and thick on that side. There's no sun on that side. And why does this matter? Because the sunlight is how the trees make food. So they don't waste time growing limbs into the shade. They grow limbs toward the sun. And if the sun is only shining on that tree from one direction, because of the shadowing of a larger tree or something, then it's going to completely change the way the tree is. But if you begin looking at these things, then they become apparent. And if you find a tree that's solitary in the middle of a meadow, it'll be symmetrical.
Well, no, I don't think it will be. Honestly, it will be more symmetrical than one that's been the one that's been shaded on one side for sure. But
it should favor the south, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, as you say, they're not gonna put a lot of resources growing into in directions they're not getting a lot of light. It's very easy to anthropomorphize these trees and say they want to grow south or anything like that. What we have to remember is it's a constant feedback cycle. If a tree is harvesting loads and loads of energy through a branch, it sends resources that way. You know, it's not dissimilar to a retail business analogy. Let's say a company's got 20 retail branches around a country. if 10 of them are doing amazingly well and the managers are constantly messaging saying, I need more staff, we've got a queue of 8 people, we've got people queuing out the door here, and 10 branches are saying, like, we have tried everything you've suggested over the last year, there's tumbleweed blowing through the store, there's nothing happening. We know that company, if it's sensible, is going to look different in 2 years' time, where the stores are doing well,
Right.
more staff, bigger retail space, and that's all the trees are doing. They're going where the resources are.
Oh, that's really fun. Every tree tells a story, and we actually have a game that we play when we're out in the woods. It's especially fun when there's someone there who hasn't spent a lot of time in the woods, because when you say the forest tells a story and there's a history here, can you read the forest? And I've seen people look around and start noticing these clues for the first time, and they begin to connect in a way that, I mean, they thought they were just walking in the woods, and all of a sudden these trees, they probably do anthropomorphize some, but the tree becomes something besides just wood. Now it's an individual who has history. And we've done this before, and the evidence of logging at some point in the past, or a fire, or evidence of insect infestations, or evidence of a virus, or evidence of the way that the sun shines particularly into that valley, or which direction the wind blows the strongest. And pretty soon you begin to see every tree as unique. People will look at something and say, why is this? What do you think did that?
Totally. And you've reminded me of some of my most fun experiences. I see my work as a treasure hunt. And when I go to a new place, I'm imagining I'm going to see a lot of old friends, in the sense of, signs that I'm familiar with. I've been doing it long enough now that it's rare I walk out and go, oh, what's this alien landscape? None of this makes any sense. But there will normally be, if I spend a few days hiking anywhere, I will expect and hope to come back with one or two that are totally unique to that region, or if not unique, certainly. I can remember the very first time that because we don't get forest fires in the way that large parts of the North American continent and other parts of the world do here in the UK. We do get them, but they're not such a big feature in terms of most landscapes. So I've seen evidence of them here, but they're not my go-to. And I was walking in La Palma in the Canary Islands, and I'm constantly looking for asymmetry. And I saw this darker pattern on the side of some of the pine trees. And it wasn't obvious fire damage, even if you're not looking for it. If something's been, torched for hours and hours, you're going to know. But this was, a brush fire or something that moved really fast through, and there was just this charring on one side. And once you spotted it, it's suddenly just so powerful, because again, you've just got to know where those fires gone through. But it wasn't one I was expecting to see that day, and it just filled me with joy. I did some really good fun in Texas with some aerial firefighters there, actually, and we were having an amazing time just comparing notes, because obviously they've got. It's one of the things I love about the outdoors is every expert has their perspective. I have my natural navigation one, but one of the joys of natural navigation is I can feed anything in. If somebody's, if they can be into mushrooms, or they can be into clouds, they can be into stars, they can be into anything. They can be into something that they, here, let's have some fun, and name an outdoors pursuit or expertise or something like that you think will have no obvious connection with navigation, and I'll have a bit of a play.
One that is very critical, life and death critical, is backcountry skiing in Colorado.
Okay.
And fantastic. I can think of a lot of ways that this plays in. So
fantastic. I honestly can't tell you whether this would work in that region, because I've only ever tried it in the Alps. But I'm not a particularly good skier, which is one of the reasons why I was with a phenomenal skier. I explained, my weird interest, even on holiday. If I'm with an expert of any sort, I want to know how they can shed light on an area in a way that I haven't thought about it, and they always can, obviously. And this instructor said, "Okay, 1 hour from now, you are going to be telling me whether you are skiing north, east, south, or west purely by sound." And it was surprisingly easy. Surprisingly easy. We happened to be out there after a particularly cold night when the sun was out. Those conditions make it a lot easier, obviously. And it's why, downhill skiers are picking certain slopes, particularly when the conditions are marginal. But I'm not an experienced skier, so I'd never thought of it that way. That you can actually, just from the sound of the snow under skis, tell what the aspect is.
That's wonderful. So several things come out of this. In Colorado, we're a semi-arid, even some places are arid landscape. And so when you see a forest, it is growing where there are resources. And so one side of the mountain often will be barren, just little scrub, maybe scrub oak, maybe not even that, maybe sagebrush. And the other side of the mountain will have a healthy forest. And you say, well, what's going on here? Well, it's the side of the mountain that holds the snow, is the side of the mountain that has the trees. Because as the snow melts in the spring, it provides the resources for the trees. And so because of that, you can look at the landscape and say, oh, east, north, south, just by looking at where the trees are in relation to the valleys. And the same thing comes into effect when you're skiing. The reason is because the prevailing winds load that snow on one side of the hill or the mountain versus the other. And that tells you where the most snow is going to be, but it also tells you where the greatest probability of an avalanche is going to be. So it is directional, and it is based on what the sun melts off and sublimates during the wintertime. That would be your southern and western slopes generally. And the snow tends to load the most on the eastern and northern slopes. Northern, primarily because they're in the shade, and eastern because the prevailing winds are from the west. So anyway, just another example.
Yeah, and let's play with snow a bit more. In the Hidden Seasons, there's a section where I'm in the Scottish Highlands, and I'm trying to. Quite often, what I'm doing is taking broad concepts that are familiar amongst any sort of outdoors communities that are having fun in those types of landscapes, and just trying to push it into some lesser thought about or more kind of niche knowledge. So what I was doing there is exactly what you were describing there. We get these asymmetries where in that part of the world you get a lot of the heaviest snow coming in from between north and east. So immediately after the snow, that's the aspect you're going to see the heaviest snow, and then you get a compounding effect because the south-facing slope is going to melt faster, and that's that I go through very briefly. But then I'm going into where you're close to losing the snow, where you've just got remnants, little snow pockets and stuff like that. It's very, very easy for our brain to go, there's a lot going on. I don't really need to know why we've got half a dozen pockets there and none over there. But there will be a story and a message, and within that, signs and a compass. So what I found was in that particular landscape, and the plants will change a bit, but this principle won't change, which is the height of the plant and its tone and color will play a massive role in how far small pockets are melting. Because if you're near to losing the snow, it's probably because there's a thawing wind, as working as well as the sun. The wind is going to thaw things very fast. And if plants, so in that case, heather was darker and taller than the grasses. So it was lifting snow up into the thawing wind, but it was also darker. So the second a bit of thawing took place, it warmed up faster than the lighter grasses. So you ended up with this kind of patchwork. Heather itself is a sun-loving plant. You get it on south-facing slopes. So you suddenly realise that what was just kind of random patches, there isn't randomness. Every single, patch of snow is telling you something.
I could see something similar if you're walking. Boy, the wind can confound this somewhat, but often walking on the mountains, when the snow is partially melted out, then you'll find that there are patches of snow in the shadow, the north side of a stone. Right? And to the south, there's no snow, of course, because the sun's to the south. And so the north side is the last to melt. But of course, the prevailing winds can confound that a little bit.
Yeah, sometimes you get really beautiful examples. If it's midwinter, so you've got a very low sun and the air temperature is staying below zero, you can have this lovely window where there is only really about an hour in the middle of the day when the sun is high enough and strong enough to do any serious melting. And then you can sometimes get these perfect compasses. I've got this photo of these molehills, and you've got literally a tail of snow pointing north, and it is dark, wet mud on the south side. And the line between the two is perfectly east-west, because there was just a very short window around the middle of the day when the sun is due south, when any melting was going on.
Okay, we really need to talk about the sun. So let me introduce the subject this way. If you're in the northern hemisphere, and almost everything we've been talking about is northern hemisphere, all of this reverses in the southern hemisphere. But if you're in the northern hemisphere, in the wintertime, the sun is further south. In the summer, the sun is further north. I live at about 40 degrees. Are you 60 degrees? I'm just guessing.
No,
I don't know.
right now I'm 50, but I'm South Coast UK, so when I'm in the UK, I'm between 50 and 60. Yeah,
50 and 60. Okay, so you're a little bit further north. So these effects get more pronounced the further north you go. But whenever my nephew asked me which direction we were going, and I looked at the sun and realized that it was lying to me, I actually said, the sun is in the wrong place in the sky. This is not possible. Right? That's when I realized that I didn't understand the sun. And so I had read about what the sun does and how to navigate with the sun a little bit, and promptly forgotten probably most of it, and misunderstood a lot of it. And so I thought that there's only one way for me to really get this. I'm going to have to do the geometry. So I sat down, pencil and paper, and actually did the geometry. And then it started to make sense to me. But it didn't until I worked through it. And it's not always obvious. For instance, I said what confused me is that I had seen the sun setting in the northwest, quite a distance north. So I thought that during the weeks around the solstice, the sun would sweep across the north part of the sky. That's not what happens. So can you explain to people where my confusion came from?
Yeah, sure. And the wonderful thing about all aspects of natural navigation, including the celestial clues and including the sun, is that there's a very fast way to understand the basics, and then you can spend decades fine tuning it. I sometimes say on my courses, I'll be standing in front of people, and if it's a short course, I say, I could spend all day here talking about the sun, but that's not why you're here. So I'm going to have to, just keep it. So I'll keep it to the brief version, which is, as you've said, if you are north of the tropics, which is almost all of the USA and Canada, there are tiny bits that just sneak into the tropics, don't they? But for simplicity, let's say we're north of the tropics. The sun will be due south in the middle of the day every day of the year. Now, I'm choosing my words carefully there, because the middle of the day is not always 12 o'clock on your watch. So the middle of the day, our expression midday is, of course, an abbreviation of that. But the sun will rise and keep on rising until the middle of the day, at which point it is at its highest and it is due south. It will then start to set. So the words morning and afternoon are just telling us morning is literally when the sun is rising and it is east of us, and the afternoon is when it's setting and it's west of us. There has to be a moment between those two times when it is neither rising nor setting. It's at its highest point. Shadows are their shortest and they point perfectly north. So what I encourage people to do, instead of, I think it's really healthy to kind of get into the geometry, as you say, and stuff like that. But the very first thing I encourage everybody to do, if they're not totally used to the middle of the day stuff, is anywhere near lunchtime, if you see the sun for the rest of your life, you just go, that's roughly south. If it's a little bit past lunchtime, you go, that's a bit west of south. If it's a little bit before lunchtime, you go, that's probably east of south. And that's it for the very first pillar, if you like. Now, rising in the east, setting in the west. On the equinoxes, which is late March, late September, the sun rises due east and sets due west. Those are the only 2 days of the year when the sun will rise due east and set due west. Every other day of the year, it is either going to rise and set north of east and west, or rise and set south of east and west. Now, if we're just throwing labels like east and west and north and south around, it can get confusing. So there's a technique for not getting confused here. What you do is you say to yourself, what time of year is it? Which pole is pointing towards the sun? And however you answer that question wraps it all up. So let's work through it. as we're chatting now, we're in December. We're not that far off midwinter in solar terms. The winter solstice being late December. So it is winter to us because the South Pole is pointing towards the sun. So the answer to the question, what time of year is it? It's winter. Why is it winter? Because the South Pole is pointing towards the sun. The sun will rise and set south of east and west. If in June you go, okay, what time of year is it? We're near midsummer. Okay, why is it summer? The North Pole is pointing towards the sun. The sun will rise and set north of east and west. The only regular pitfall is there's part of the brain that feels if it rises north of east, it should set south of west and vice versa and stuff like that. But that's over the years. There's no button I can push on the side of anyone's head that's going to make all of this stuff come together in 2 seconds. But over many decades of teaching it, that question is the one that avoids confusion. You say, what time of year is it? Which pole, north or south, is pointing towards the sun? That tells you whether the sun will rise and set north of east and west or south of east and west. There's one little thing I'll add to it. I mean, as I've mentioned, I could honestly talk about this for 8 hours going into more and more detail, but there's only one thing I want to add at this point. There's nobody, particularly people who have an interest in the outdoors, who has lost relationship with the length of day. So for some people, they find this helps to think about it. Why are days so long in June? It's because the sun is tracing a massive arc. It's always going to go through south in the middle of the day, whatever day of the year it is. To make a really big arc, you've got to rise in the northeast and keep on rising and rising and rising and rising and rising. Really long journey. We're going from some parts of the world, 4 a.m. You're rising for 8 or 9 hours until you're, at your highest point. And then you've got a really long arc all the way down to northwest. That is your June day. This time of year, December, we've got short days. How do you make a short arc? You go from roughly southeast, you climb a little bit. A few hours later, you're at your highest point, which is not very high, due south, and then you've got a short journey down to southwest. So if people are really struggling with this, use a traditional compass or a smartphone or a place where you know where's north, south, east, west, and just trace with your hand. Go June and point, northeast, and then trace a massive arc in the sky all the way up to high south, and then all the way down to northwest. That's June. December, really short arc, point southeast, up a bit to south, down to southwest. Everything else is in between those two extremes.
I love that. What a beautiful explanation. Something that I've added to my smartphone is an app that shows me where the sun is, and it traces those arcs that you just described, and then it'll put like a Google map under it, so you can actually see where the sun should be in relation to what's right in front of you. And so you can say, at 4 o'clock this afternoon, the sun's going to be there. But then you can change the date and say, where's the sun going to be in March? Right? And it really has helped me to visualize everything that you just talked about in a much better way.
I'd really encourage that use of technology, and in the sense that I'm not a Luddite or a technophobe. I think we can accelerate, because what we're trying to do here in natural navigation really is catch up on where our ancestors would have been at this stage of life. They would have spent, depending on your age, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, just tuning into this stuff. What we're trying to do is fill in the missing few decades. And if technology helps with that, which it very often does, that's why I was saying any way you need to. So I'm always saying to people, use the technology to make a fun challenge out of it. You don't even need to step outside. You can glance out a window and have it, do your best to gauge where north is. And you go, I can't see the sun, but I can see the shadows are going that way. It's roughly lunchtime, so that's going to be north. And then whip out the smartphone. Why not? And there comes a really magical moment where you're checking things with technology like a smartphone. And there's this really wonderful moment. I've seen it, it happens with the North Star quite a lot, because people are less confident in stars because typically they're not using them much these days. But once you know the techniques for finding north, south, east or west using the stars, it's very, very normal to want to check that with technology. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But the magical moment comes where it might be the third time, it might be the 33rd time, it doesn't matter. But there comes a moment where you realize that if the technology is not telling you the North Star is north, the problem's in the technology. By which I mean,
Yes.
if you can find the North Star and it disagrees with your smartphone, the
Your
smartphone's having a
smartphone
bad
is
day.
wrong. Some of the people already know that my day job has been an RF engineer. So I design cellular networks. And one of the things that I used to have to do was what we would call shooting azimuths of the antennas to make sure they're pointed in the correct direction. And from the ground, you'll stand where you're directly in front of the antennas, and then you use a compass. And of course, you figure out what the declination is so that you can actually estimate to within a couple of degrees if that antenna is pointed in the right direction. So the reason I tell this, I've done it 1,000 times. One day, this was a rooftop site, and there are people up on the roof working on it. One day, I'm trying to shoot the azimuth, and I'm just like, man, they have really messed this up. And I'm looking at my compass, and the people on the roof yelled down to me, "Hey, look down!" I was standing on a steel manhole cover. And so my compass was no good whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is going on here? So it's one of those moments. Technology fails for a variety of reasons. And I love what you just said. When you know better than the phone, you know that something's happened. Now you've arrived at some new level of understanding.
Yeah, I mean, when I
That's
did
super fun.
the solo flight across the Atlantic is a good example of that. Now, to do any sort of serious aviation, you have to get an instrument rating, and part of the training there is trusting the instruments more than what your inner ear in particular is doing. When we accelerate, the inner ear is telling the brain that we're pitching up, and vice versa. And lots of people in the early days sadly lost their lives through trusting their inner ear. So you're trained to trust the instruments more. But there are lots of situations where it's a visual thing. So I was taking off from memory northeast out of Goose Bay, Newfoundland in May. And there was a lot of snow, ice, and water in the first few hours, and I'm taking off towards sunrise. Now, if I wasn't aware and very comfortable that the sun is going to rise well north of east, I could have had a horrible experience where I'm looking at all this kit, the first time solo in this aircraft type over water. And that, if all I was thinking is the sun rises east every day, that's a pretty much a 45-degree difference between what the instruments are telling me and what popular perception of what the sun does is. So in that situation, it was lovely that all the things kind of married. I was kind of like, yes, my magnetic compass is telling me I'm flying near northeast. All the electronics are telling me I'm flying near northeast, and the sun is northeast. There is no mismatch there at all.
Well, that's where the source of my confusion came from, obviously, in the story about my nephew asking which direction we were hiking in the forest. Let me give you a scenario and tell us how you would manage it, just because I think it happens a lot. It's wintertime. You're in the forest. You've been having fun, skiing, sledding, hiking, whatever you've been doing. You've not been paying attention, and suddenly you realize, oh, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Let's say 3:30. Just give it a little bit more. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. I've kind of lost my way, and I want to know what west is. I want or at least one of the directions, so that I can make sure I'm taking the best route out of here. But it's winter, and it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and the sun is somewhere southish, somewhere westish. How do you find your way in that scenario?
Okay, so me personally, when you're using the sun and you have quite a lot of experience of using it, what you're always doing is finding out where it is between two fixed points. So the sun is either going to be, assuming it is not exactly sunrise, sunset, or the middle of the day, which is quite rare, nice examples, but it's going to be between sunrise, the middle of the day, or between the middle of the day and sunset. So then all we've got to do, the middle of the day bit's easy. We've nailed that already. That's due south. That's never going to change.
Yes.
So all we've got to do, all we've got to do is think about where sunset is, and we go back to the time of year. So it does get a little bit more advanced, and there is a bit more thinking because latitude comes into it. And just as a weird thought experiment, if there's a group of 6 of you hiking, the sun will have a very slightly different position of sunset for each of you, even if there's only 3 feet between you. Because whenever you move north or south at all, the bearing of the sun changes very slightly, and whenever you move east or west, the timings change very slightly. But to take that to a more practical point, the further from the equator you are, the more extreme the seasonal adjustment. So when I was mentioning earlier that in the south coast of UK, I'm at 50 degrees north coast of Scotland, you're nearer 60 degrees north. That's the sort of difference that is well worth taking into account. By which I mean, I would know that in late December, for example, in the circumstances you're giving, I would expect on the south coast of England the sun to be setting just on the west side of southwest. But if I go all the way up to the north coast of Scotland, it's going to be just past southwest. So I don't think there's much value in us going down to the sort of degrees and this sort of stuff. But when I've used this as a primary navigational tool, what I am doing is tuning into the degrees. I will know to the number where the sun will set for that latitude. And then the next part of the puzzle, and this is getting more advanced. I'm not expecting anyone to fall in love with the subject with this level of detail. But as your latitude increases, the angle of all celestial objects, sun, moon, stars, and planets, when they set, gets shallower. Now, I can explain that in a slightly neater way. At the equator, things rise and set vertically. At the poles, they move horizontally. But we spend all of our time typically between those two. So it's a number called your co-latitude, which is 90 degrees minus your latitude. So nobody needs to drown in the detail here. I'm just sort of explaining what I would be going through if I was genuinely trying to use the sun as a primary navigational tool in a toughened scenario. So let's stick with those UK numbers of 50 and 60 for now. On the south coast of England, the sun will be setting at an angle of 40 degrees. So let's say by measuring with an extended fist, which is 10 degrees, the sun looks like it's 1 hour from setting. I am then building triangles visually, and you can actually do it with bits of string and stuff like that if your life's going to depend on it, working out back from sunset where the sun is. So to make it slightly more easier to digest, if you stick out your fist and work out the sun is 1.5 fists above the horizon at the equator, it is 1 hour till sunset, and then you work out where your sunset, bearing is going to be, and that will be it because it's going to set vertically. If you're at the North Pole, you're not going to be doing this exercise at all because the sun's going to be moving horizontally parallel to the horizon. Right. Everywhere in between, you are visualizing more often than not, it's fairly casual. As in, if I'm at 35 degrees north, I will be factoring in a steeper sunset and going, okay, for simplicity, let's say it's setting southwest. The sun is currently perhaps only 10 degrees south of that. Whereas if I'm up at 55, 60 degrees north, I'd be going, okay, the sun will be setting south of southwest, and it is going to be 15 degrees south of that right now. I mean, there have been times, not hundreds of them, because it's, as you can hear, it's a pretty convoluted process. But there have been times where I'm doing that, and it takes, 15 minutes concentration. And the 1 in 60 rule: if you're 1 degree out and you travel 60 miles, you will be a mile from where you think you are. So, if you're 10 degrees out, you don't have to travel that far before you're not close to where you thought you would be. So there have been times where I do it like that. But the really fun, interesting thing is, however hard we have to work at any of this stuff in the beginning, the brain takes over the process, because our ancestors were finding their way across continents without, mostly getting lost, and they weren't thinking about things like co-latitudes and stuff like that. This is just, again, a way of trying to shortcut back into that way of thinking. It sounds much more technical than it is. What happens on the first half of the day is you're thinking, right, okay, co-latitude 90 degrees minus 50 degrees. Okay, the sun is going to set at 40 degrees, and By the end of the first day, you're not even thinking like that. You're like, oh, the sun's there. That's what that means. It's all very doable. Right. Otherwise, none of us would exist.
I love what you were saying about the fist. It's such a great tool. And I use my fingers kind of bent and I hold my arm straight out. And a hand, the straight out from your arm represents about an hour ish. Right. And I'm being general here. But a few things that I've learned that allow me to judge a lot about time and distance and everything is I just have to remember, what time does the sun set or rise? Generally, this time of the year. I have to know if it's daylight savings time or not. Right? And then just remember, okay, well, the sun's going to set in the northwest, so I'm just going to use my hand to track that arc until I get to the sun, and that's how many hours until sunset. And assuming you can see a flat horizon, and in Colorado you can't. You're always looking at an elevation, so you have to get a feel for if I were in the plains, where would the horizon be? But those sorts of things allow you to tell time to within about 15 minutes and to know direction very, very well, because you're just paying attention to it. And as you pay attention to it, it becomes kind of natural.
Absolutely. And if we take the high ground example, it is technically, for you, sunset when it goes behind the ridgeline. Even if so, you can have this situation where you're out for a couple of days hiking, and you phone home that is maybe 2 hours drive away or something like that, and you will have different sunset times, because you're behind a ridge, or home's behind a ridge or something like that. So I make this point occasionally that you can make a fun low tech time machine. If you've got a friendly kind of slope, you can play the tape forwards and backwards. You can literally make the sun rise again once it's set, just by heading uphill.
Yeah. One thing that I've done before is go to a high point and watch a moonrise, and then drive down to a low point and watch it again.
Yeah.
Because it's fun to see it twice. You can do the same thing with Mercury, right? If you want to see Mercury, which is hard to see because it's so close to the sun. You can expand the amount of time that you get to see it by changing your altitude or your elevation. Tristan, here's what I would like to do. I would like to talk a little bit more, but we've burned through our time. And so for the sake of the listeners, I want to make sure that they have all the information they need to learn more about this stuff, because it really is a glorious way to interact with nature. And this may sound like a silly example, but I'm going to say it. You see a lovely guy or a handsome fellow across the room, and you're like, wow, I would really like to get to know that person. And then you get a little closer, and maybe you introduce yourself, and, you have that conversation close up. You can tell what color their eyes are. Maybe pick up some pheromones even, right? And then comes the magic moment when you take her hand, or she takes yours, or he takes, whatever the genders are. But the point is this: that magical moment when you're holding someone's hand and you say, this is different. We're together right now, experiencing this thing together. That's what it's like in nature when you have something like this that causes you to connect with it, to pay attention. You're not looking at the other person across the room anymore. You're holding the hand. And you're in it together. And I just want to say that because this is the magic of what you have spent decades working on. And I can't underexpress how wonderful I think it really is. If you're spending time in the woods, you need to know this stuff, not just so you can find your way out, but so you can hold the hand.
I've never heard it put that way. That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for that. And it matches very nicely with a lot of feedback I'm getting at the moment, where people expressing something that I felt a lot, which is people are telling me I should connect with nature, and it's a lovely idea, but I don't know what they're talking about. And so I've even written about connecting with nature, but my whole point is don't go into a natural environment, whatever it looks like, and think that something magical will automatically happen. But it will do if you set yourself very simple, ancient little conundrums. Just say to yourself, what time is the sun going to disappear behind that ridgeline? Or, can I find north by looking at these leaves or these pine needles? Can I work out, what time the rain will start tomorrow by looking at those cloud shapes? And then all that happens is 10 minutes disappear, and you are on a different plane and a connection, and holding hands, as you say.
Well, let's go over how people can learn more information. And then if you don't mind, if you have the time, I would like to talk about weather with you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the most recent book is The Hidden Seasons.
Yep.
And where can they find that?
That's available all the usual places, wherever you get your books. It's really well distributed globally, but not least in North America. So, support your local bookstore if you can. We miss them when they disappear, but it is available
Yes.
through online booksellers if you don't have a local store.
So just look for a Tristan Gooley, and it's not just that book. There are many, like we mentioned in the beginning. You have a course, The Beginner's Guide to Natural Navigation. Where do people participate in the course?
Yeah, that's an online course which I never imagined doing until COVID, forced me to reinvent, like so many people, how I did things, and some of the most interesting lessons in life are just so obvious in hindsight. What I hadn't realized, I'd been running courses for probably about 15, 16 years by the time that happened. And what I didn't realize is the number of people are frustrated because they could never geographically get to places where I was running them, typically in the UK.
Right.
So with an online course, you can be anywhere, and it's tailored towards the northern temperate zone. But that's most of North America is it's relevant to. And you can find out information about that and the books on naturalnavigator.com.
Well, the Adventure Sports podcast has the most downloads in English-speaking countries. So that takes care of, the UK and Canada and the United States. But we also have Australia and South Africa and many other places where there's a lot of English spoken. So New Zealand, the point I guess I'm getting at is that it all still works. You just have to flip it.
Yeah, and I do get there's a page on my website explaining the differences for Southern Hemisphere adventurers, but the principles are identical, not just globally, but universally, by which I mean you can navigate from the shape of a sand dune, whether it's in a big desert or just on your local beach. But those same patterns can be found in Mars, So the principles are
Right.
truly universal. Some of the labels change. So we still get our prevailing winds, from one direction, wherever you are in the world. It's just the label we put on it that changes.
You also have a newsletter called The Sign of the Week. Is this an email, a e-zine sort of a thing?
Yeah, it doesn't go out every week. It's a little bit more sporadic than that. But it
It's
typically
the sign
starts
of when
with
I get around to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But my work. I'm a one-man band. My work. Sometimes I'm not in front of a computer for a couple of weeks. But yeah, basically, I start with a photo and the question. Which way we're looking, north, south, east, west. And then I unpack the clues that are in the photo down the bottom, and in between, I'm giving updates about books and the other things that help pay the bills.
Oh, that's fun. How can people participate with this newsletter?
If you go onto naturalnavigator.com, there'll be a window that pops up, and if it doesn't, then just down the bottom of the homepage, all you've got to do is put in your first name and your email address, and you'll get one as soon as I get round to it.
Okay, Tristan, I'm going to do that because I want to play this game. This is great. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your time. I do want to talk about weather, but that means we're going longer than we usually do. And for people that don't have the time right now, just reload the episode later and you can listen to all of it. But weather. Okay, so weather can help you with navigation as well, but just understanding what weather to expect can really be valuable when you're in nature. So, do you have some tips for us? How do you discern what the weather is likely to do that day or the next day? What do you do?
Yeah, in my book, The Secret World of Weather, I go into literally hundreds of the more sort of detailed signs, but they generally fit into families, which we can cover in broad terms now. Wind direction. If you read any accounts of exploration or interesting travel from more than 100 years ago, you will find wind direction pops up in logbooks, accounts, everything like that, for the simple reason that since prehistory, we've known that the direction that the winds are coming from give us a very good steer in terms of the conditions we can expect and the probability of change. So if you just monitor the direction the wind's coming from, morning and late afternoon, and there is no significant change in that, the probability of a massive change in the weather is very, very low. So that's a nice big broad thing that our ancestors knew, and that is not too tough. Then what I'm typically doing is just adding layers to that. A lot of this clues and sign reading is just putting two pieces together to come up with something a little bit richer, more interesting. Birds perch facing into wind. They land and take off facing into wind. So if you happen to notice all the birds facing one way in the morning and in a different way in the late afternoon, you might well have rain by breakfast time the following day, because they are telling you the wind direction has shifted significantly. So
that's cool.
So and then we've got the whole family of clouds, and that's I spent years and put together so much detail on that, and there are some broad trends. Things step down as we go from dry to wet. So at the very highest level, stars start twinkling more as the moisture level increases. As we go from a dry blue sky type of, perhaps high pressure weather system, when there's a front or some significant change on the way, there will typically be moisture in the highest part of the troposphere first, and that makes stars twinkle more. So that's at the very early, very sensitive sort of thing. That's only people who are really, really wanting to tune in are going to spot that sort of thing. But the bigger, bolder trends are the typical stepping down of the clouds. So we start with the wispy, we call it candy floss here. I always forget what it's called in your part of the world, but
cirrus.
The cirrus clouds. But what do you call it? What do you call candy floss? The sort of fluffy stuff. We get them at fair. It's sugar candy, but it's. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, just the cotton candy is
cotton candy. That's it. Yeah,
cotton candy.
So you get those wispy, icy high clouds, which you can still see the sun through, and typically it just steps down. And you don't even need to know the names. You just need to know if clouds are getting lower than the forecast. You'll typically start to sense wind direction changes as part of that process as well. So it goes cirrus, cirrostratus, altostratus, nimbostratus, and you're getting wet at that point. But whilst that's all going on, you're sensing wind direction changes, animal behavior changes, things like that. There are some big, bold things that signify change, and within that there are some of the most interesting stuff is map making as opposed to forecasting. So cumulus clouds, the bubbly ones that you see at the start of The Simpsons, those are the opposite of random. They are mapping something below them, typically high ground towns, dark coniferous forests or islands, the places that warm up fastest.
That's because that's where the air is rising.
Yeah. It's a really nice example of non-randomness and nature not lying, because a cumulus cloud is sitting on top of a thermal. There is no other way that they are formed. There are different ways thermals are created, but in weather terms, it's one area of the Earth's surface warming up faster than the other areas, and that's not random. It's not like one patch of the Earth goes, oh, we haven't got hot for a few days, let's get hot. It'll be because it's a town or a city which is typically hotter than the surrounding countryside, or it's an island because land warms up faster than water under sunshine, that sort of thing. Our ancestors would find the idea that you first sense land by seeing land from the sea absolutely hilariously incompetent. You don't have to spend much time. You don't have to spend much time on the water or around mountains for that matter. There's a whole family of clouds, and you'll have seen many of them in Colorado that signify high ground even when you haven't seen the peak itself. All of these clouds are making a map.
That's very, very interesting. Cumulonimbus is something in the American West that's a big deal, because these are the thunderstorms that they bring hail, they bring lightning, and when you're mountaineering, the cumulonimbus. But if the cumulonimbus clouds are forming, it's probably too late. You should have headed down a while back. But you get the nimbus clouds forming, and that means look out. And then the cumulonimbus are going to follow. But what again confounds that a little bit here is that the topography of the ground forces air to rise when there's a prevailing wind. So sometimes it's not just where things are warmer. It's also where the mountain is pushing the air up.
Yeah,
and that
yeah, yeah.
causes clouds to form as well. So we get localized weather events. You'll see storms form on the west side of a mountain, go over the peak, and then dissipate as they go down the other side.
The meteorologists call it the sort of orographic effects when you've got the force lifting by the high ground. But there are normally signs. So for a thunderstorm to form, whether it's being pushed up by high ground or by a thermal, you need an unstable atmosphere, and there are clues to that.
Yes.
So thunderstorms are they're not random. If you look at a map of thunderstorm locations by month, for example, they're not randomly distributed. Exactly as you're saying, these patches are high ground. It doesn't matter whether you're in Europe, North America, or anywhere else for that matter. Moist, unstable air hitting high ground leads to thunderstorms. But how do you tell it's unstable air? Well, if there are no clouds at all in the sky, a thunderstorm being the first thing you see is quite unlikely, because there has to be some moisture in the atmosphere for a thunderstorm to form. So what we're looking for there is signs that the atmosphere is unstable, which just means that clouds can go into vertical kind of runaway. And the signs of that is any clouds, particularly early in the day, that are taller than they are wide, because that is an unstable atmosphere. So storms can form very, very fast, and I don't want to give people the impression that a blue sky means you're safe. But what I'm saying is, it is more the opposite. It's more if at sort of 10:30 in the morning, you see towering cumulus, bubbling clouds that are definitely taller than they are wide, that is a sign of an unstable atmosphere. So if you're heading into the mountains and you've seen that in the morning, it's a high risk situation.
Interesting. What about lenticular clouds? First of all, what do they look like?
Yeah, they're nicknamed flying saucer or UFO clouds, and they're a sort of gentle version of what we've been talking about there. So instead of in an unstable atmosphere where things can go into runaway and lead to terrible storms, the lenticular clouds are where you've got air being forced over a summit typically. And it's being pushed up to a level. It's expanding, cooling, leading to condensation, which is the cloud we see, and then it dips back down, compresses, warms, and disappears. It's something we will all have seen many, many times. It's not a particularly strong sign of weather to come. It is not telling you things are going to get better or worse, for example. In weather times, I don't know if the right adjective is sensitive or fragile, but what I mean is they will disappear if there's a significant change in wind speed or direction, typically. So if you see them forming and they don't change for a couple of hours, it's very unlikely something dramatic's about to happen. They're saying the airflow is fairly steady.
Something that's interesting is they often look like they're not moving. But what you're seeing is the condensation that's happening in one place. The air is still moving, but the cloud is forming because of the pressure differentials and because of the wind, essentially. I've interviewed like paragliders who will go through a lenticular cloud and find that there's a 60-mile-per-hour updraft right through the cloud that doesn't appear to be moving.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's fascinating, too.
It's a really good example of where these patterns are universal. And once you get used to seeing them in one context, you recognize them very quickly in another. So, for example, that what we're talking about there in physics terms is a standing wave, which is where the atoms and molecules are constantly changing, but the pattern we see isn't. And you see exactly the same thing in water. If you look at white water, kayakers will be all over this, but basically, as water hits a boulder or an obstruction, it gets forced up in this way that you can spot, but only if you're sensitive to it, into a pattern called a pillow. But then the water will plunge down the other side of the stone, and it punches what's known as a hole, because it is literally a hole. It punches a hole. Now, water doesn't like holes. It's constantly trying to reach equilibrium. So what you find is water will try and fill the hole from the downstream side, and that sets up a standing wave. You don't need to travel far. If you look over a bridge at any stream or river that's got a bit of white water in it, it doesn't need to be, Grand Rapids or anything. It just where you can hear the water, which is a sign of white water of any kind, even if it's small, you will see these standing waves. And again, the wave doesn't appear to move anywhere. As long as the flow and the obstruction stay constant, the wave will stay there. And it's a standing wave. Every water molecule is constantly changing, but the shape stays the same.
Yeah, you have hundreds or thousands of gallons per minute that are flowing through there, but it looks like it's just staying there, just kind of undulating, right? That's fascinating. Interesting. Okay. A lot of people have heard the old adage, red in the morning, sailor's warning, red at night, sailor's delight. We have issues with that in our modern day, but what is that about?
Yeah, the red in the morning is less clear cut, but the red sky at night, shepherd's or sailor's delight, is fairly straightforward. It's not a cast iron guarantee, but if you can see the sunset, by definition, you can see far to the west, and most weather, in the temperate zones comes from the west. So it's basically, you know that experience when the weather's bad, you really can't see very far. Not only can you not see the sun, you can't see horizontally very far. So if you are seeing a red sky at night, you are seeing many, many miles through clear air to the west. It's as simple as that. And it's, that's not to say there can't be bad weather. It's just a probability thing. If you can see many, many miles to the west, which is where most our weather comes from, the visibility is good in the direction our weather comes from. QED, the forecast is not bad.
Yeah, I've noticed that air pollution impacts that one a little bit too. And that's why I mentioned our modern world, because if you have a bad smog layer to the west, you're going to get that red. And it might be misleading.
But only if you can see the sun. So it'll change the colors, but it won't change. It shouldn't change the general diagnostics.
The visibility.
So in the hidden seasons, for example, I talk about how the sunsets are seasonal. So we get, for example, at harvest time, if you've got a lot of arable crops in your part of the world, you are at harvest time, there's just going to be a lot of dust in the air, and the sunsets are noticeably redder then. Lots of other places will have, seasonal fires. We've mentioned fire. You get a lot of smoke particles in the air. The sunsets change. I mean, we had a red moon visible from the UK and all over Europe from forest fires in North America last year. I think, or it might have been the year before, but quite recently. All it takes is some particles in the atmosphere, and the colours change, because the blues will get bounced out by the scattering more than the reds.
We had days last summer when you could look at the sun bare-eyed without burning your eyes, because it was so obscured. The opacity of the smoke was so high. It's eerie. Not that I would recommend looking at the sun. But there's a related dynamic that I want to mention, because it's been very helpful for me, and that is that high-pressure air tends to hold more dust and pollutants in it, and low-pressure air tends to be clearer. And so on a morning in Colorado, when you're climbing a 14er and you've got the perfect bluebird sky, you can see forever, it's crystal clear, you think, what a beautiful day, look out. Because that's a low-pressure system. And the storms can roll in.
Yeah. I mean, that's not one I've come across, but it makes good sense. Yeah, the high pressure, it's a lid on things. Sinking air, low pressure is typically ascending. So I mean, that's interesting. On a totally different scale. That's why the deserts are where they are. Most people would kind of imagine, well, the equator's getting hit with more solar energy than anywhere else on planet Earth. So why don't we have the deserts there? It's for that reason you're talking about there, which is you have most of the instability and rising near the equator, but that leads to lots of tropical storms. And then the air is sinking much, at higher latitudes, both north and south, but it's super dry. Hence the Sahara Desert isn't on the equator.
Well, Tristan, this has been fascinating, and I love the conversation about weather. We could probably talk for 3 more hours just about weather itself. But some of these things just become kind of second nature, like you were talking about, when you open your eyes and observe. And so, man, we could go on forever about this stuff. Again, go to naturalnavigator.com, and from there I'll bet you can find everything else to get a hold of Tristan and to learn about what he's been working on. Tristan Gooley, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really fun. and very informative.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Really, really enjoyed our chat, and keep up the great work with the podcast. It's really good fun.
Okay, thanks. Everyone, start observing nature more, because that way you can hold the hand, get out there and have some fun.